why do economists, monetary economists, people who have contributed substantially to monetary economics, completely change their perspective regarding an independent monetary policy when they enter the RBI. And I think that process requires us to understand a little bit about the formulation of policy and the implementation of policy. In India, as I believe in large parts of the world, the formulation of policy when it comes to experts is typically done in what one can call an engineering fashion. That is, you assume that whatever exists can be wiped off, and you can create a new ideal and construct it. It's like an engineer goes down, I happened to be in IIM when this campus was built. It was it was agricultural land, it had other constructions, but without a thought that those constructions were removed and a new campus built on it. That's the kind of conception in many ways that economists tend to have. We start off with a completely blank sheet of paper and then work out an ideal argument and then take that ideal argument into reality. It gets battered around, but still we say, okay, that's the ideal. What to do? It's either politicians or somebody. We can always find our favorite person to blame. But if we look at it from outside, from the pact of policy, then it's very obvious that the idea of an independent monetary policy is itself quite flawed. Quite simply because there's nothing that can be completely independent. I think even if you look at classical economics literature on monetary policy and the independence from debt management and the need to keep it separate, that whole argument continues right until the 2008 crisis. Once you have the 2008 crisis, when it's time for you to pick up whatever weapons you can to target the crisis, at that point, all these divisions fall apart. You begin to look at it in terms of finding whatever weapons you have and the tools that you can intervene with in debt management have to be consistent with your monetary policy. So immediately the idea of keeping them completely separate begins to erode. In fact, if we can look at it in a larger framework, from the 2008 crisis itself, you'll see the interconnections in a way that are much, much wider. For instance, the 2008 crisis might have started as a subprime crisis in the bank, prompted by the banking processes in the United States. But once the crisis was in full bloom, as it were, you ended up in India trying to respond to the lack of demand by stepping up your fiscal deficit and so on and so forth. You went forward with it, and the links were very, very clear. So it's a debt management problem which emerged here from a banking crisis somewhere else. And you find these processes are deeply interlinked. In fact, you could go further and say it's not just a matter of official policies in different places. It's a general environment. Today, it's fashionable to bash the RBI and to bash anything that's independent and within the country. But we tend to forget that in the 70s, at a time when the rest of the world was advised to have a free market as far as the flow of foreign funds was concerned, India and the RBI took a position that was different. And we could argue about that for very long, but essentially the fact remains that when the Latin American countries fell into a debt trap, India did not. And you have to give credit where it's due. You have to recognize that the RBI did play a role in maintaining that independence. So you have these connections, and one can go on about it. Like the GST now is facing serious trouble in generating the revenues it should be generating, or it was economists expected it to generate is probably a more accurate description. And that will have its impact on the fiscal deficit, whether we like to, how we sort of cover it up is a different matter, but it will have impact on fiscal deficit and possibly, I would say very likely, on public debt. It's going to emerge from it. So the point one is making is, and we can go on in the Indian context with the fact that you're moving from the unorganized sector to an organized sector means your provident funds are going to go up, and if provident funds go up, that is a part of public debt, which you have to take into account when you're making monetary policy, or you have to come to terms with the very nature of the fact that a part of your public policy has got to deal with the nationalized banks who are in a mess. And when they decide, as they have done recently, to hand over IDBI or get LIC to invest public funds in, or deposits or whatever premiums that have been paid into IDBI, a bank that is clearly facing great difficulty, we are once again linking up a large number of issues which won't even come under the official category of public debt, but nevertheless is a fact of government spending or government resources that are being diverted. So, as I said, if it's all so interconnected, what the problem is, how do I deal with independence, right? And because there's no doubt that if I allow this kind of complete freedom, when it's saying it's all interconnected, so what does it matter, who does what, you're going to face all kinds of challenges which are being posed by people who are taking policy decisions without any scrutiny. The idea of the LIC taking over IDBI Bank comes up much later. There's really no economic analysis of why that should be the way forward, other than the fact that it's convenient for a government that's already facing fiscal pressures from various directions. So one would try to argue that the way out is really to go back to the starting point, and that economic policy in India is largely done through many parts of the world is largely done through an engineering mindset. You're looking for an ideal construct, you put it onto an architect's kind of a drawing board, and then bring it and impose it on things. The assumption is that you can forget what is happening on the ground, or you can ensure it is forgotten. If need be, you can erase whatever is there and reconstruct it. But in reality, we find that there are too many factors to allow you to do that. It's not just like in a developed world where you have established systems, you can say you take care of this and somebody else takes care of that and you get a certain amount of independence built in. It's a set that too many things are continuously changing. We are moving from, as I said, from the informal sector to the formal sector, at least hopefully. We are moving from agriculture to non-agriculture. You're moving from the rural to the urban. And as you try to work out all these dynamics, any rigid formulation would not work. What you need to do instead is to go back, I think, to the conception of the old-fashioned doctors, who used to see a patient who's obviously a living patient, and who do not have the option, at least not until now, of actually killing a patient and starting afresh. Right? You have a patient, you try to do what you can, you recognize that your interventions will have side effects, you get into it. The fact then is you function with a certain degree of autonomy. You try to ensure your medicines do not have other side effects. This is something that is an approach that economists, there was a time when it was taken in a limited sense back to the classics and physiocrats, etc., but I won't go back to the past in front of Mr. Bhattacharya. But essentially the fact of the matter is that you have these very clear specific elements where you intervene in a process. You recognize the economy as a living process. You recognize the fact that there will be pressure on the government to use LIC funds to take over IDBI. Even if it's undesirable, it's like an undesirable side effect or undesirable set of symptoms that are emerging in the economy. How do I intervene at that point? At that point, to say I'm going to go in for inflation targeting is extremely over-focused. Because there will be periods when you say I'm going inflation targeting, then you identify the specific tools you're going to use for that, the specific remedies, medicines you're going to do. And as Professor Bhalla pointed out, they don't always work. The fiscal deficit, we were all brought up to think that any expansion on fiscal deficit will be immediately inflationary. And there was a time when it may have been, but clearly over the last decade and more, it has not been inflationary, and there's no clear relationship, as Professor Bhalla said. So really, the issue really then is that how do you intervene? How do you recognize the side effects? You must then make a distinction between the autonomy of what you're doing and complete independence. You cannot take actions because they work in an ideal situation, irrespective of whether they kill the patient. And in that sense, any talk about an independent monetary policy must be tempered, at least, by the processes of debt that are there. And we have just finished a fairly substantial large sample survey of rural debt in Karnataka. And you find astonishing kind of patterns emerging, including the fact of a clear preference for the informal over the formal, including the fact that the informal is developing instruments that the formal cannot hope to match. They have systems there which Chiranjeev Singh would know, the idea of a cheaty, where essentially it is an instrument that can at the last moment be changed from a saving instrument into an insurance instrument. These are instruments that the formal sector just cannot match, right? And you're going to deal with that kind of a real life situation, and you're intervening there, right? It's very easy for people like me who are economists and trained in economics to say that this is what you should do, and if something goes wrong, there are enough people to point fingers at. But ultimately, I think we need to move from what I would call an engineering mindset to a diagnostic mindset. And then see the extent. You certainly need autonomy. You need to trust your doctors. Your doctors need to have the autonomy to function with it. But ultimately, they cannot be insensitive to side effects. They cannot assume that things are not interconnected.